I get this feeling more and more as I switch between Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise. I feel that the weapons in Rise are mechanically better than the weapons in World, but some weapons don't feel as satisfying for me personally. I love the Switch Axe in Rise. It's an incredible weapon that can flow between its two different modes in such a fluid and dynamic way that makes it my favorite weapon to use in Rise. And using it in World, getting hit with the stark contrast of how different the weapon feels, but then also noticing that I still found it satisfying, in fact, more satisfying than in Rise. And I've been trying to understand why I feel this way, because I feel the same way with Longsword and Sword and Shield. All the weapons I mentioned I find more satisfying in World than in Rise, even though Rise has the superior versions. I believe, anyway. I think there are two reasons I find them more satisfying in World. One is sound design, and two is the camera. So for me, sound design is extremely important, especially when trying to convey something like weight, which might sound strange, but imagine you were playing a game with a massive sword or hammer, and both had slow but powerful looking swings, but whenever they actually hit something, it would make a very faint or generic sound effect, or maybe it even sounds like a dog's chew toy. Now, obviously, that's a little ridiculous, but the point being, it probably wouldn't be too long before people stopped playing a game like that because weapons with bad hit sound effects don't properly convey the weight that the weapon's supposed to have. Even if the screen shakes and the camera changes to make it more cinematic and the enemies get sent flying when you hit them, it still wouldn't feel like it has any weight. The only other way to try and convey a sense of weight would be through a different type of stimulation, like vibration in the controller whenever you hit enemies. Visual indicators alone aren't enough. Now, you can disagree with me about this point, but I firmly believe this to be the case. And so I find a lot of the sound effects in Rise to be of lower quality when compared to World. Now, I don't think this is the case with every weapon, but certainly the ones I've previously mentioned. Now, I'm not saying that the sound effects in Rise are bad. In fact, I actually think they're pretty good, but I don't think they're better than World's. And so for me, there's an element of satisfaction when attacking that isn't necessarily missing, but diminished. Now, what I find funny, somewhat funny, is that Rise has more incredibly flashy and visually stunning moves, but fails to use the camera, to some degree, to give those visually striking moves a more cinematic feel. But in World, the sound design and camera work together to provide a really cinematic experience, one I find incredibly satisfying and one I think is hard for Rise to match. Now, this isn't always the case. For instance, my favorite move from any monster is when Gormagala stands on his back legs and is using his arms to prop himself up and then shooting a massive projectile at you. Now, this move is extremely easy to avoid, but what I like is that the camera pans out so you can see the entirety of Gormagala, and it really makes it seem like he's doing a extremely dangerous move, and this is something that happens for monsters, but not as much for players. In World, there was a nice mix. Now, this is entirely personal to me. Others might not notice these small differences, or have noticed and don't really care. I would say while these differences aren't enough to hamper my enjoyment of Rise, or change how I feel about it in any significant way, it just sits in the back of my mind and makes me think of just how much more amazing Rise could be. And it also gives me a better appreciation of World, and makes me excited to see what the next Monster Hunter title will be like. But anyways, that's all for me.